Well, welcome to Class 11. Welcome back from Thanksgiving break. For your assignments this week, read the next chapter, which is chapter 8 in the book. You've not only got your regular quiz, which you see there at the bottom, but also you've got the chapter ending questions on pages 155 to 157. Type that into a Word document, submit it into the study place, there in the assignments tab. As always, make sure you've typed your full name and section number at the top of the page. Some of you still don't do that and get points taken off when you don't do that. Note you don't have to answer the for further study question on page 154. Okay, so just heads up on that. Oh, I didn't see your prayer request there. Actually, both of you. Tell you what. Why don't we save these for? Can you guys remind us at the end of class? We'll end in prayer this week, and we'll lift up those two things. Let me just make a quick copy of that so I've got it. And and speaking of got it, I need to give you. Let's see. You'll want to open this up because hopefully if we have enough time we'll get to this at the end of class as well. All right. Okay, so that's your work for next week, and of course there's some more memorization. The italicized part is the new part, so hopefully you've already started on that and are keeping up with that. All of that you see on the screen is not new, okay? Only part of that is the new stuff for next week. So just keep plugging along and staying current. Any questions on that? That's right. Waco, not wacko. Very good. So, well, good. Well, again, we're going to be talking about keeping the peace today. We've been working our way through the Constitution and studying the American system of civil government. And as we've been doing that, what is the underlying theme that we continually see? By now, it should just be automatic. Come out of your lips. What is remember we've talked about the theme of this class, the theme of the Constitution, even biblically the theme for government. What is that theme? Limited government. Yes. Limited. And why is that so important, especially from a biblical worldview? Why is the concept of limited government so important? What biblical doctrine? Because man is inherently bad. Yeah, man is sinful, or sinful nature. So the chapter you just read and the chapter that you're going to read for the next week get to the core of how the founders decided to limit the power of federal government. So now we're really getting to the whole core of how they did this, to the crux of the answer or the solution, I guess you might say. But let me ask you this. Suppose our class was being posted on the internet. Does anybody here know how to use HTML? Have any of you ever created a website? I mean, I'm not talking about Facebook or something like that. That's all been done for you. Have you ever, anybody here, tinkered with that? No website, but you dabbled a little bit. Okay, a little. Yeah, well, now things are getting so user-friendly, you almost don't need to know HTML, right? But anyway, if this class had been posting, the Constitution on the internet, you could say that we've been using the preamble, which you see there pictured on your screen. The preamble of the Constitution would be our index page, and each line in the preamble is like a hot link that takes us deeper into the Constitution. So if you were to click on "We the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union," well, that phrase speaks to federalism, right? The states are sovereign, but they came together to form a union. So there you have the concept of federalism. Then you see the phrase establish justice. Well, how did they establish justice? Well, they established three branches of government, the separation of powers, in order to establish justice. And then today, we're going to be looking at ensuring the domestic tranquility. Ensuring the domestic tranquility. Now, does the Constitution give the federal government unlimited power to keep the peace? What say you? Gosh, no. Like, Mr. Brown, what a stupid question. No, of course not. That's right, it doesn't. But if you didn't know, where would you go in the Constitution to answer this question as to what power the federal government has? Where would you go in the Constitution to see what power? Clauses about Congress's power to create armies. Okay, and so that clause is in what section of the Constitution? Remember, it's the quote-unquote John 3:16 of the Constitution? Yeah, Article 1, Section 8. Good. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And in there, you see the constitutional power to ensure the domestic tranquility, but there's not an unlimited power to do so. Now, let's take a look at what Thomas Jefferson said when he was drafting the Kentucky resolutions. Now, you remember with the Alien and Sedition Acts, you had Congress making it a crime to criticize public officials. Well, part of Jefferson's argument was this: hey, Congress, the Constitution only lays out 4 types of crime that can be punished, and punishing those who criticize the government is not one of those powers. So this is what Jefferson said. The Constitution of the United States has delegated to the Congress a power to punish treason, counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. If you're wondering what securities are, those would be government bonds. Okay, so counterfeiting. Number 3, piracies and felonies committed on the high seas. And number 4, offenses against the laws of nations and no other crimes whatever. So when you read this list, does it seem that it covers most crimes that are committed every day in the United States? No, right. I mean, they're very specific in terms of the types of crimes that are covered. In fact, what common types of crime are not mentioned here? You know, you turn on the TV and you watch like an NCIS or something like that. I mean, what are the common type crimes? Robbery, theft, murder. Yeah, notice none of those things are listed. I mean, unless it has to do with an offense against the law of nation. You know, that would be like, you know, hijacking a ship on the high seas or something like that, or offenses against the laws of nations. That could also be an American who's counterfeiting the currency of a foreign government. You know, things like that. I mean, you know, these, you know, they're not, they're things that happen, but they're not the common types of crime that are dealt with in courtrooms around the country every day. The murder or assault of a citizen of another nation fit murder of a citizen of another nation. Perhaps. Probably not if they're just an average person here from another nation. However, if they had some diplomatic status, then yeah, that could be then where the federal government gets involved. But if they're just somebody here on a green card, then no, I don't think. because that's typically going to be handled at again at the local level, the jurisdiction where the murder occurred. Odd question, and hopefully I've given you an accurate answer. It was my best stab at that answer. But the bottom line is this: the Constitution only gives the federal government authority over crime in 4 very limited areas, right? I mean, these types of crime are very limited. For example, treason, which is one of the 4. That's not an everyday occurrence. I think the last case of treason that we had a conviction for in this country is Robert Hansen. That was 2001. Okay, you guys were little kids then. It's not an everyday thing. Even the WikiLeaks Army specialist who was convicted, he was releasing stuff to WikiLeaks. You may be familiar with this guy, Bradley Manning, who changed genders to Chelsea. Even it wasn't treason, it was espionage. Snowden, I don't think he's been convicted of anything. I mean, yeah, there's some people who say he's a traitor. There are other people who think he's a hero. I'm not sure you find a jury that would, that would unanimously convict him, because a lot of people really like what he did. But anyway, so again, it's not your everyday type of thing. It's almost something of a rare occurrence. Why is he hiding? Well, yeah, if he comes back, he will be arrested and charged. Now, what I don't know is what would he be charged with? Because it could be treason, it could be espionage, or something like that. But cases like treason or counterfeiting, I mean, these are things that happen, but again, they're not the typical day-to-day things. So anyway, you get the idea. The Founding Fathers weren't giving the federal government authority to punish the common day-to-day type of crimes. Those weren't the type of things that were being covered here. So if the federal government only has 4 types of limited crimes to punish, then would there be a great need for a federal police force? No, I mean, obviously not, right? So the Constitution gives no authority for a standing police force. Thus, the responsibility to keep the peace, constitutionally speaking, is mostly local, not national. The founders did not want a professional police force at the federal level. They certainly didn't want Abbott and Costello. I love that picture. You guys know, you're probably too young to know who Abbott and Costello are, but they are the ones. Do we have a national police force? Yes, we have several. All the different agencies. One congresswoman put in a request, and the answer she got, and I don't know who analyzed it for, if it was the Congressional Research Service or what, but they came up with 353 federal law enforcement agencies that have the power. What would be the arrest power or power to carry firearms? I'm drawing a blank on what the term would be. But anyway, 353 law enforcement agencies. I've seen other numbers that put it as low as 50. But either way, you've got scores of federal law enforcement agencies, yeah, like FBI, CIA, Marshals. Marshals are the oldest ones, but you've got many at the federal level. Back to Abbott and Costello, they're the ones that do the who's on first, what's on second, that great comedy skit. But it wasn't during the one where they were dressed up as cops. Yeah, that is a very funny clip. But anyway, why do you think that the founders didn't want a federal police force? What do you think? What was their reasoning? Right, because of the potential abuse. Exactly right. Federal police forces, they were concerned, could become a potential problem. So they wanted to limit, see here again, this theme of limited government, they wanted to limit the power of federal officials. They didn't want a huge government force with guns. For example, when the FBI was created in the early 1900s, how many years was it before their agents started carrying guns? Do you remember from the chapter? 30 years, right? Well, why do you think it took so long for Congress to start doing it? I mean, now we couldn't fathom FBI not being armed, right? Well, why do you think it took so long for Congress to start arming them? Well, to answer that question, you really have to consider when the FBI was started. It was started at a time when people felt that the federal government should not be exercising police powers. They felt law enforcement was supposed to be local. And yet, roughly 100 years later, when the Department of Homeland Security is started, shortly after 9/11, how long did it take for their agents to start carrying? I mean, it's almost like that's a silly question, right? I mean, they started carrying immediately. Well, why did that happen so soon? And yet, 100 years before, it took them 30 years to arm the FBI. What do you think? Yeah, even their name, Federal Bureau of Investigation, indicates their original history was actually about investigating. They were basically federal accountants. That was what they did. They were good at catching bad guys, based on, um, not following the tax code and things like that. I mean, that was a lot of what they did. But as Daniel points out, oh man, Sierra is still not able to hear anything. Hang on a second. Why don't we say, Sierra, try rebooting your computer entirely. That could make the difference. But yeah, as Daniel was pointing out, people's opinions change, and the thinking today is much different. People don't often think about what the Constitution says unless it somehow supports their position. The Constitution is not as highly regarded today. Now, you saw in the book why this is such an important issue, though. I mean, what's the big deal about this? Well, you read the story about Donald Scott's ranch, right? A multi-jurisdictional police force made up of several police agencies assaulted his California home in 1992. Now, the sketch there is from the official report following what happened. Now, you remember, what did they say they were looking for on Donald Scott's ranch? Yeah, they said they were looking for drugs. Of course, they didn't find any. Sadly, it resulted in his being killed. Investigated his death, that the motivation for the land grab, so that, and then the homeowner has to forfeit the land and the government ends up getting the land. Now, thankfully, they're called forfeiture laws, where, because of some illegal substance, even without a trial, your land gets confiscated. Thankfully, asset forfeiture laws were changed in 2000 to prevent these types of horrific land takings from occurring. All right, not a problem. Well, I'm telling Sierra not a problem. She's not going to. Here, let me type her. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that, yeah, exactly, brutalized form of eminent domain. That's right. This is the kind of thing that the founders feared. And even at the state level, the founders were cautious about creating standing police forces. Um, even this type of police force was rare, the one at the local level. Have any of you seen the Andy Griffith show? Great show, right? Maybe you've seen it on TV Land, with Mayberry, the town of Mayberry, and Barney and Barney Fife and Andy Griffith. Great, great show. Um, well, we didn't always have police forces in this country. So even the small type of police force that you see in the little town of Mayberry wasn't always existent in our country. Do you remember when the first, now talking about a full-time professional state police force was created in this country? When did that happen? Do you remember from the chapter? Now, I realize that's different from the town of Mayberry, because the town of Mayberry was a made-up town, and it was just a town. But the first state police force was New York, and yeah, it was in the 1800s, 1844. So for many years, the colonies and the states went without a statewide force. Now, here's the deal. It is easier to just pay someone to keep the peace. So why do you think it took so long for people to start hiring professional cops? I mean, it's a lot easier to just pay somebody to do it. What? Think they were dumb, stupid? I mean, it's like somebody finally hit themselves on the head with the palm of their hand and said, "Oh, what were we thinking?" Julia says, because the Tocqueville said it worked. We'll talk about the Tocqueville in just a few minutes. Mark says, because of the principle of local police versus professional police. Yeah, see, it certainly would have been more convenient. But as Mark is suggesting, they were concerned that professional forces could become dangerous to the people's liberties. Now, think about it this way. Imagine a family has a dangerous dog like a Doberman in the yard. I can give you a picture there. I always have students tell me that, no, Dobermans aren't dangerous, they're just misunderstood. Well, just imagine a dangerous dog in the yard, but the family has small children. Why on earth do you think a family would still choose to have a potentially very dangerous dog, maybe like a Doberman, in the front yard of their house when they have small children? What would be, it does look like a cutie though, doesn't it? For protection, Jaylene says. Absolutely, for defense, right? But then here's the problem. Okay, so you've got this dog for defense, and maybe it's a warning. It's the first warning, like the canary kind of thing, but it's also there for defense. But how do you keep the kids or the Doberman from attacking the kids in the yard? You've got this dangerous dog. It's there for protection. How do you keep it from attacking the kids? Jaylene says train it. So does Julia. Brooke says chain it. Abby says restrain it. Okay? You train it, but have you ever heard of a dog, quote-unquote, reverting? Chain it. What happens if the dog is chained, but the kids still get too close to it on their own? Because, let's face it, little kids don't always obey, or they're clueless, they're mobile, and they get within reach of the chained, vicious dog. Remember, my grandparents had a pretty rough guard dog that they kept fenced up, and one day it got out and it mowed me over, and it was doing huge circles in the yard, and just about every time I had just stood up again, it was coming back around for another hit, and it knocked me down again. Thankfully, it didn't chew me up, but it knocked me down 5 times just doing so. I mean, it was almost like a cartoon, Julia says, you can train it, chain it, restrain it, and contain it, and yet the danger is still not gone. Bingo! That is the problem. So, let me ask the question again then. How do you keep the Doberman from attacking the little kids if all those things aren't going to work? See, there's one other idea that none of you have put forward. Yeah, I hate getting bit. Call the police. Yeah, well, Abby, that's good, but that doesn't. Wait, are you saying call the police when the dog attacks the kids? Get a little dog. Well, by Mark saying get a little dog, that suggests that you're getting rid of the big dangerous dog and you're getting the little harmless dog as a pet, right? Chihuahua. I almost might take my chances with the Doberman. You can just see the little Chihuahua going, Taco Bell. But that's the point. The best way to protect the kids and keep them from getting attacked is not, okay, you got to think outside the box. It's not having the Doberman in the first place. They won't get attacked by the Doberman if there is no Doberman. I mean, I know that's like so obvious you can miss it, right? But you see, that's what you saw in your reading for this week. The founding fathers, to put it this way, they got rid of the Doberman, quote unquote, at the federal level. They removed the huge danger. They said, we'll have no federal police. And they didn't give any authority for having one. By the way, a lot of countries have experienced the dangers of having national police forces. We've even had problems in our own country, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But, you know, somebody might say, and one of you might say, okay, the Doberman, yeah, they might threaten the kids, but the Doberman's there for protection, just like the police, they're there for protection. So if you don't have federal cops, then how do you catch the bad guys? How do you catch those guys who are blowing up buildings, guys who are committing crimes in several states? How do you arrest them if you don't have a federal police force? Julia says, what about the states? Yeah, you know, you guys are probably too young to remember the Beltway snipers. This was back in 2002, but these two guys, they were both Muslims, by the way, interesting, found a very clever way to snipe people at just many random different places. And the reason it was clever is because they would shoot from out of the keyhole of the trunk of the car. So nobody ever knew where it was coming from. And they were doing this in several states, from Maryland to D.C., Virginia, Alabama, Louisiana. They had killed people. And even though the FBI got involved and they set up a hotline, they had their agents on it, it's interesting that they weren't caught by the FBI, even though the FBI got involved, because this was a several state incident. And these days, if you know criminals are crossing state lines, that can get the FBI involved. But it was the local police working with citizens, truck drivers, that actually worked to apprehend these two killers. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, yeah, they were committing crimes in many different places, but as Mark points out, and as Julia points out, yes, state forces, local police forces, you know, I mean, working together, sharing information, they were able to bring these guys to justice. Now, on the other hand, what if it truly is a national issue? Let's say it's a federal constitutional issue like treason or counterfeiting, something that the states don't really have authority to deal with. It really is a federal issue. What police force then, constitutionally, what police force should apprehend and arrest them? What did the founders say in the Constitution? I know, Mark, you must have been typing that before I finished asking the question, because obviously they wouldn't have said the FBI since there was no FBI. But what would be I mean, it wouldn't be Congress. I mean, they wouldn't be the actual police force. So who would it be? Not the Army. They're not allowed. And there's actually laws that prevent them from enforcing the law within the country for this very reason. That, and you'll actually see this in the upcoming chapter next week. I don't think I've seen the answer yet, so let's go to the next slide. The militia, or the posse. That's how the Constitution says the federal government should ensure domestic tranquility. Isn't that interesting? It's by using the militia. What's the militia? Well, by law, still, it's actually every male who is aged 18 to 44 is still a member of the unorganized militia, and that's the pool that could be drawn from. Now, the picture that you see right there, that's an old school picture of the militia. Here's a modern militia in Arizona. The sheriff of, I forget which county it is, but anyway, one of the Arizona sheriffs, Sheriff Arpaio, calls them his posse, he calls these guys his posse. Now, they're not full-time police. They're not full-time deputies because these guys have regular jobs. They're doctors, lawyers, teachers, pilots, but they go through the same training as cops. They wear the same uniform. They help patrol malls and street corners to keep their towns safe. And guess what? They carry guns. By the way, the sheriff says that his posse doesn't cost the taxpayers a dime since they're all volunteers. But see, this is the constitutional police force. Here you see them at the state level, but they could also be used at the federal level. And did that seem odd? Not using federal police, but using ordinary citizens instead? I mean, we don't really do that today. I mean, we were talking about earlier, we have scores of federal law enforcement agencies today. But how well would that have worked back then? And that's a great point, Julia. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a fundamental shift in our country, whereas at one time the Militia Act of 1792 required every male to own a firearm, a military firearm, and if they didn't have one, to purchase one. And whereas today, well, there's still a lot of people that believe in the right to keep and bear arms, but there's an increasing, actually, I don't want to say increasing, it's actually been decreasing, but let's just say there's a large percentage of people that don't think people should have firearms. But how well did this really work? I mean, you know, getting citizens involved to enforce law, really? Well, it's hard to imagine this today because we haven't done it really for decades. The closest we have on a massive level to what they did early in America would be the America's Most Wanted show, which I don't think is running anymore. But it used to run, I think, in the 80s and 90s, and you know, maybe, who knows, maybe they show rebroadcast. But it was an interesting show. A lot of people would watch it, and it actually led to a lot of arrests. My wife's father, my father-in-law, in fact, he just passed away last month. Wait, we're still in November. He passed away earlier this month. But years ago, he was in the hospital. He just had gallbladder surgery. And he's watching America's Most Wanted. And, you know, of course, when they take out your, you know, gallbladder or something like that, I mean, it hurts. So, you know, he's on like morphine or something like that. And, you know, so he's not all there. And anyway, he's watching America's Most Wanted, which is probably not a good idea to do. Yeah, he was very high because he calls his wife, my mother-in-law, and he's like, "Tom and Jean, are you watching America's Most Wanted?" He's from Alabama, so he does have a southern accent. You know, "Are you watching America's Most Wanted? Do you see that woman they're looking for? That's my nurse. You gotta come get me out of here. My life's in danger." I mean, he was like freaking out. We were howling. I mean, this was so funny. The nurse was not the one they were looking for, but you know, he never lived that one down. Funny stuff. But, you know, this show actually did result in a lot of people being arrested and captured. Well, in early America, it was everybody's duty to be involved in catching the bad guys, and everybody took it seriously. Because if you didn't, you could actually be fined. They called it the hue and cry. When you heard the hue and cry, you had to leave whatever you were doing and get not mobilized. What do they call that when they mobilize the posse? I'm drawing blanks today. But anyway, what a difference from today. We might get involved as a result of an entertaining TV show like America's Most Wanted, but outside of that, we really don't want to be bothered. People don't want to be they don't want to vote. They don't want to be bothered with jury duty. And when it comes to something like this, law enforcement, I mean, people would say, "Oh, come on, that's the police's job," and sometimes to people's detriment. That's exactly what happened. A very famous case, or you might say infamous case, in 1964 in New York City. Kitty Genovese was a bar manager. She had just gotten home from work. Very late, or you might say early in the morning, 3:15 in the morning. This was March of 1964. She parked about 100 feet away from her apartment door, and she was walking to her door. Well, she was approached by a man named Winston Mosley, and he later admitted he was just looking to kill a woman. And sadly, she was there at the wrong time, wrong place, wrong time, and he picked her. So he approached her. It got kind of brutal. I mean, he started just stabbing her and stabbing her, kept stabbing her. Well, meanwhile, Kitty is screaming, crying for help. Now, this is New York City, so a lot of people heard her. News reporters actually investigated this, found out 38 people heard her cries for help. You see the article title there. Not one of them came to her defense. Not one. One neighbor did yell out, "Leave that girl alone," and a few people did call the police. The title says 38 who saw murder didn't call the police. Well, there were a few who did. No one's quite sure why the police didn't give it the high priority to these calls. They took over half an hour to get there. Earlier, some of you were saying, you call the police, call 911. You realize there's about 200,000 violent crimes every year where the police don't show up within the first hour. If your only defense is to rely on 911, in fact, I've got a book in my office, and the title of the book is Dial 911 and Die. And the whole book is just examples of people who called 911 and they're dead now because the police did. And by the way, this is not cop bashing. I mean, it's just a simple fact. The police can't be everywhere and get anywhere in a moment's notice. I mean, that's just simple, the harsh reality of life. So it's in no way putting down the police, who I think in most cases do a phenomenal job, enforcing the law, defending people, et cetera, et cetera. So, it isn't putting them down. It's just the harsh realities that if that is your only defense, even if it takes them 5 to 10 minutes, which is a pretty good response time, you can still be dead, very dead. You'll be cold by then, So in all, Mosley stabbed her, he tried to rape her, he stole money from her. After half an hour, police and medical units finally arrived, but Kitty sadly died on the way to the hospital. Now, if you ask me, it's not surprising because New York City doesn't make it easy for people. I can imagine people being terrorized into a situation where they're going to become the victim. I mean, I think this would have had a much different outcome in North Carolina or South Carolina or somewhere like that. You would have had 15 people running out with their shotguns saying, "What's going on here?" Right? But what a difference from earlier days. I mean, this idea of, it's not my problem, I can't get involved. I mean, remember what de Tocqueville said, right? And one of you referenced this already. Which country had professional law enforcement? Was it France or the United States? France. And so we, rather than having professional law enforcement in the 1830s when he was writing his book, we used a militia or posse system, right? And yet, which country did a better job bringing people to justice, according to this eyewitness who had opportunity to compare both countries, he said ours worked better than theirs. I mean, isn't that amazing? I mean, it might seem at first glance logical that you would do better with professionals, right? And, let's face it, if you were to say 1-to-1, a professional, is going to have better training and know better what to do. So why is it that the militia/posse system did better? It's for this simple reason alone. If everyone is involved, then you dry up the quote-unquote proverbial ocean that the criminal fish can hide in. I mean, it's like Woody telling Sid in Toy Story, "We're everywhere," right? I mean, but that's the way it would be like. I mean, so if you're a criminal and you've committed a crime in a place where everybody's involved, where do you hide? A charming Frenchman said it works better, so it must be the truth. It's like if you find it on the internet, right, it must be true. So the militia posse system really did work, but it wasn't just at the state level that they used average citizens. It was at the national level, too. There was no federal police force. Now, you read about this in the book. Who was it that George Washington used to put down the Whiskey Rebellion? Now, George Washington was a president, and he's enforcing federal law. So who was his police force? Was it the ATF? Or the FBI, or the IRS? No, it was the militia. Exactly right. See, there were supposed to be very few federal crimes, so there really wasn't a need for a full-time professional police force. As I mentioned earlier, it's been over 10 years since we've had a treason case. Now, what about the danger aspect? I said earlier that the founders got rid of the Doberman. They removed the huge potential danger, no federal police. Obviously, we've brought the Doberman back. Here, boy, right? I mean, we've brought the Doberman back to protect us. So how's it going? Have there been any problems? Well, let's start at the state level and work our way up to the federal level. One of the most horrific examples. Abby, are you saying you can't hear? Is this another person who the sound has gone out? Oh, got it, hopefully. Okay. One of the most horrific examples of police abuse that shocked the nation occurred in 1965. Now, obviously, this was before all of your time and for most of your parents' time, before their time. But blacks were protesting the fact that police had shot and killed a civil rights worker, and the fact that blacks were being prohibited from registering to vote. So on March 7th, 1965, thousands of people got together to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery and bring attention to the abuses that were occurring. Well, with the cameras rolling, police formed a picket line at a bridge in Selma, Alabama. You see that up there in the upper left. Well, things got very ugly. Police fired tear gas and then went on a tear where they were clubbing, bullwhipping them. The picture in the upper right was shown around the world. The news footage pictured on the bottom was broadcast around the country, and people were really shocked by what was going on in Alabama. This day became known as Bloody Sunday. Now, that's not the U2 song, Bloody Sunday. They had their own Bloody Sunday in Ireland. I think it was Ireland. It's Britain or Ireland. I'm pretty sure it was Ireland. Anyway, similarly, the picture here on the left, the dog biting the boy, really pushed people over the edge. When this picture hit newspapers across the country, most Americans said, this has gone too far. And really, examples like this are a reminder of why we need limited government. This kind of thing is exactly why the Founding Fathers wanted to prevent agents at the federal level from being armed. Now, we've only been talking about abuses at the state level so far, but in principle, this is the core reason for wanting to limit government power. I mean, were they just being paranoid? Well, consider this. Can you think of any examples of government abuse before police forces sprung up in this country? Can you think of any examples of government abuse in this country before the advent of police forces? Or let me put it another way. I mean, you can think of it from the other perspective. Did the sheriff posse system ever result in police abuse? I mean, there may have been some, but it sure would have been hard for one sheriff and one deputy, you know, one Andy and one Barney, to do much damage, right? Because in a country where we believed in the right to keep and bear arms, that one sheriff and one deputy would have been way outgunned, you know? So it's hard to abuse the people when you've got that situation. I mean, really, the only examples of abuse that you find in this country before we started implementing police forces were from the paid full-time forces such as the Redcoats. Because after all, there were no statewide colonial police forces, not before 1844, right, in New York. You know, like that commercial, New York City, right? Now, speaking of redcoats, in 1770, a crowd of colonials were throwing snowballs and yelling at British troops. And you've probably heard of the Boston Massacre. The day ended with the British firing on the colonials, killing 5 men. Of course, there's differing views on this, depending on whether you're a Brit or an American, and what history you look at. But at the end of the day, 2 soldiers were convicted of manslaughter. I'm glad my own incident with snowballs didn't end this way. When I was a kid, you know, I mean, I was in school. I wasn't homeschooled. There was no homeschooling. Anyway, we would get off for school when it would snow. And so, you know, we're building forts and sledding, and of course I pitied the cars that braved their way down the road, because we would hide in the bushes and throw snowballs at them. Well, the one mistake we made was when the UPS truck went by. You know, UPS, man, nothing stops them from delivering the mail. I don't remember a postal service truck, but I do remember the UPS truck. Anyway, so he's driving down the road, and my friends, we all hop in the bushes, and then we get out, and we, you know, right as it's driving by, we just pelt the truck. Well, this guy slams his brakes on as best you can do on a, you know, snowy road, and he jumps out of the van with a baseball bat in his hand. And I mean, he's got a look of fire in his eyes, and he looks right at me and my friends, and the snow turns yellow around us, if you know what I mean. We were scared to death. We take off running. You know, he never chased us. And looking back on the incident, I realized, you know, he had no intention of beating the pulp out of us. However, you wouldn't have convinced me of that at that moment. I thought my life was over. I thought this guy was going to kill us. I think now he just wanted to scare us and make it so that we would never throw another snowball at a UPS truck, which, by the way, I have never since then thrown another snowball at a UPS truck, so it worked. So thankfully, yeah, my snowball story ended much differently than these poor guys in Boston, because some of them ended up dying. So, you know, historians will look at this and as an example of police abuse. I mean, certainly Paul Revere made hay out of this. He engraved it and produced several copies of this, and, you know, helped publicize this. But for the most part, again, you don't read about police abuse in the 1600s and 1700s and most of the 1800s because there was no police for the most part. Now, beginning in the 1840s, we started creating professional police forces, and there have been problems. I mean, we just went over some examples from the 1960s, but it wasn't just the violence on March 7th of 1965. I mean, during that whole time period, the police were used in many parts of the country to keep blacks as a permanent minority. They were kept from voting. They were forced to eat in different restaurants, drink from different water fountains, go to the bathroom in separate restrooms. Any of you seen the movie 42? You actually see that in that movie. I mean, it's really, really sad. They had to ride in the back of buses when taking public transportation. They couldn't sit up front. And so they started protesting. Hey, this is not right. They were having marches in many cities, and many of them were arrested and beaten. And even when the police weren't involved, they would look the other way and allow the KKK. Okay, that rhymes. They would allow the KKK to terrorize blacks in the South. Now, y'all know who the KKK is? Yes, exactly right. So, yeah, Julia and others, I mean, there was lots of examples of this that have since become kind of infamous cases that have been retold. But, with the KKK, I mean, obviously these are the guys who run around in white sheets and white hoods, and they're very unfriendly to blacks and Jews. And, it's interesting that most of them were out of the Democrat Party. In fact, one of Robert Byrd of West Virginia at one point was the senator who was in the Senate Majority Leader. He was a former Klansman, not just a Klansman, but like a Grand Dragon leader, Democrat from West Virginia. But anyway, these guys, they would terrorize the black neighborhoods, shoot into their homes, burn crosses on their lawns. The police wouldn't do anything to stop it. That's why a lot of these during these early days, a lot of the blacks were Republicans because the KKK were Democrat, and just based on that fact alone was enough to drive them to the Republican Party. Now you see that book there on the right, the Deacons for Defense, were started as a result of the oppressive police and the KKK. These guys were black civil rights workers who ended up forming impromptu militias to help protect the people. And guess what? The terror stopped when armed blacks started shooting back. Do any of you know who Condoleezza Rice is? There's her picture. Any of you heard of her? She was in government, again, back when y'all were little. But she was our Secretary of State for George Bush from 2005 to 2009. And she tells the story of how her dad would take his shotgun and with other armed blacks in the neighborhood would form nightly patrols to protect the townspeople from the KKK. And interestingly enough, once armed blacks started shooting back, guess what? The terror stopped. When you think about what they were doing, these armed folks really amounted to a type of militia. They were armed, they were organized, and they helped preserve the peace in the community. Yeah, a lot of Republicans have wanted Condoleezza Rice to run for president. Sometimes the militia is absolutely needed when the police are refusing, basically because they're incapable of protecting the people. A recent example of this would be some of the hurricanes that have hit, like the big one in Katrina, 2005. You saw the militia at work after the mayhem that was created by Hurricane Katrina. The police fled with the hurricane coming. In fact, a lot of people fled with the hurricane coming. I mean, they're people too, and to a certain degree, you don't fault people for wanting to get out of harm's way. And considering New Orleans is under sea level, people realize, hey, a lot of extra water, things aren't going to go well. Well, the flooding in New Orleans was terrible. Now, some people did stay back, and after the hurricane, you had a lot of roving gangs going into neighborhoods, and what happened, and there's been news reports on the Algiers neighborhood in New Orleans where residents of the neighborhood gathered together, they shared firearms, and in some cases got into firefights with these roving gangs, but they were able to push them off, keep them from breaking into homes. Is the militia that is meant to have armed power not random civilian? Becomes moment violence is involved. Well, certainly I'm not saying the roving gangs are like a militia. I'm saying that the people organizing are acting as a militia. Now, technically, militia is a blend of the people and civil power. Yes. So to answer your question, oh yeah, the KKK. There's no way you can consider them a militia. But in terms of the people who were defending themselves against the KKK, because they were legitimately defending themselves, but in some cases they were doing it without, in fact, in opposition to the police, where the police were just letting the KKK have their way with the people. No, not a problem. But here you see these positive examples of people using guns to protect themselves, protect their neighborhoods. You see the guy in the upper left, the little black gun in his waistband. He's protecting his home, which was destroyed by the hurricane. You see in the lower right-hand corner the messages, you loot, we shoot, has a nice ring to it. People recognize that as being a very positive use of guns. Now, there was a very notable, horrendous use of guns 2 years later in 2007. Our country, and you may remember this, saw a horrid school shooting where 32 people were murdered. That was at Virginia Tech, which, by the way, was a gun-free zone, which meant that teachers were officially prevented from being able to protect students. Even if they had a concealed carry permit, they weren't allowed to carry a gun to work and to be able to protect people. Before that, the worst school shooting that happened was in 1966, and it's interesting how it was stopped. It was stopped by good people with guns. The shooter was Charles Whitman, and he climbed the clock tower at the University of Texas, 27 stories, and he was shooting down at people below, killed 17 people. I mean, this was quite a massacre. Well, Ramiro Martinez was the cop that climbed the clock tower to shoot him and take him out. But it's interesting, he took one citizen with him, a guy named Alan Crum. He deputized him and gave him a rifle, and the two of them together climbed the clock tower. And it's interesting, Austin newspapers reported later that dozens of armed citizens, hearing about the shooting, actually left their places of work and grabbed their firearms, went to the scene of the crime, and once citizens started shooting up at Charles Whitman, nobody else died. Because once citizens started shooting up at him, every time Whitman would poke his head above the railing or the banister or whatever, the barrier up there, to take a shot from down below, so he couldn't do that anymore. So he had to resort to sticking his gun through, little peepholes and things like that, which was not effective at all. And so basically armed citizens prevented a worse massacre from occurring. So, it's really kind of a great example of police working with armed citizens, working together. You don't see a lot of examples like that. There are some recent examples, but you have to look for them. They're hard to find because typically today the mentality is, it's just, excuse me, it's just the job for the police. Now, let me pause here for a moment. I mean, I know we've covered a lot of ground. I want to see if there's any questions. This is really part one of part two. Some of your questions may actually be answered more fully in the next chapter and during next week's class. But with that said, are there any questions? And just to remind you, homework is for next week. Homework. One of the things that is quite surprising, and so I'm going to give you a little foretaste of that right now. And do it via our weekly quiz. All right? But I'm going to ask you to hold off on answering on the weekly quiz for a few moments. But as you know, so not seeing any questions, I'll move to the next slide. James Madison, of course, the father of the Constitution, made a bold statement during the Constitutional Convention. And so I wonder how you would answer this. And again, don't answer yet, but his question was, as the greatest danger to liberty is from, this is actually something that you are going to be reading about in your homework next week, but don't cheat on me. Don't go looking for the answer. But from what you know of the Founding Fathers, how do you think James Madison would have answered this question as the greatest danger to liberty is from? Again, don't answer yet. I'm going to give you some potential answers to choose from, but again, don't answer yet. But some of the choices I'll be giving you would be, well, the greatest danger to liberty is from restricting the freedom of speech, or denying religious freedom, or taxation without representation, or colonial soldiers, or A and B above, or none of the above. Now, don't type anything yet, because first, I want to contrast this with the possible choices that people today might pick in answering this question. You know, I don't know if you guys have ever heard Sean Hannity. He's got a radio show from 3 to 6 Eastern Time. He also has a TV show at night from 10 to 11. But anyway, sometimes, haven't heard him do it recently, but he used to do this Man on the Street segment where he sends one of his guys who works for him to hit the streets and ask people questions. You see how like the average person doesn't know anything, But anyway, if he were to hit the streets and ask the question Madison posed, how do you think people might answer? Well, here's how Republicans might answer. What is the greatest danger to liberty? They might say, being Republicans, well, electing certain senators from Illinois to be president. I know that spandex is perhaps a little scarring, right? Now, to be fair, about half the country is Democrats, so how might they answer? Who would Democrats consider to be the greatest danger to liberty? Well, for Democrats, what's the greatest danger to liberty? It would probably be electing certain senators from Texas to be president. If you've been watching the polls, he's been slowly creeping. In fact, polls show that he would actually beat Hillary Clinton in a head-to-head contest. Anyway, leaving that aside, our previous commander-in-chief used to be the favorite Darth Vader whipping boy of the Democrats. Yeah, George Bush, with his Sith father there in the background, right? You can just hear him. I am your father, right? So what about the libertarians, though? What would be the greatest danger to liberty for them? Well, they might say incredibly high taxes. I mean, right, for a libertarian. And they would be joined by the middle class and the wealthy. And then there's the social conservatives. How would they answer, what is the greatest danger to liberty? Well, they might say something like banning God, prayer, the Bible, the Ten Commandments, and creation from the government schools. Right? I mean, that would probably be the social conservatives. By the way, speaking of the Ten Commandments, this is fascinating. Do you realize that the Ten Commandments we have was not the first draft? Archaeology has uncovered what the first draft said, and it was actually much shorter. It was just 2 commands. It was Yahweh or the highway. Admit it, some of you were taking notes on this, weren't you? I've had students tell me that. I was starting to take notes on this, Mr. Pratt. Yeah. By the way, you know that Moses was the greatest sinner in the Bible. I mean, the man broke all 10 commandments at the same time. All right. Enough of that. Back to our original quiz. Now that we have looked at how people today would answer this question, let's look at how our founders view this. So get ready to type your answer, but don't hit enter yet. We'll do it at the same time. Maybe you already have typed in your answer, but I'll count off to 3. So how do you think Madison would have answered this question? Choose A through F. I'll count to 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Hit enter. So we have none. Wow. Look at all those none of the... What? Seriously? I have never had a section in class all answer F for this quiz. Never, ever. No, that's just what's blowing me away. Okay, did everybody answer? I mean, when do you ever have, with 6 possible responses, choosing everybody picking the same one anyway? Well, it's one or the other, Julia. The most common answer, I think, if I remember right, is usually E, where people are saying both freedom of speech and denying religious freedom. So that's usually the most common answer. But the actual answer, and E is not the right answer, nor is F. The answer is there on the screen. And the answer is somewhat surprising. And it's not B. The answer is D. D. Now, I've paraphrased Madison's answer, but here's what he said. As the greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies, it's best to prevent them by an effectual provision for a good militia. Well, like I said, I paraphrased his answer, but, it's just another way of putting it. How many people today would answer this question like that? I mean, probably nobody, right? Well, there would be some, but very few, very few. And if they did, it's only because they're students of history. Right, so there are a few students of history out there who understand, the potential sinfulness of man, absolute power corrupts absolute, yada, 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 right? But, realize, Madison was not just some kook, okay? He wasn't the only founding father who felt this way. They all did, and so in the Constitution, you read this language, and you'll see this in the chapter this week. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, the Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Now, you could easily read over that, but until you realize, and this is significant, it's the only language in the Constitution, period, certainly the only language in the Constitution where the powers for Congress are laid out. It's the only one with a limitation like this. It's the only one. So why would they put this limit? In other words, you can't just create a permanent army that's permanently funded. There's a 2-year limitation on the funding. Well, what does that mean? Well, look at what Alexander Hamilton says about this provision. Congress will be obliged by this provision, talking about the one I just read to you, once at least in every 2 years to discuss the wisdom of keeping a military force on foot. The Congress is not at liberty to vest in the executive department permanent funds for the support of an army. Why not? Well, because they considered full-time professional troops with guns to be the most dangerous threat to liberty. I mean, it's astounding to hear somebody talking that way, but that was the universal thought. And again, you'll see this in your homework reading this week, and you'll see that it wasn't just a couple of radical voices who said this. They all believed this. But hey, if you don't have a full-time, large, permanent army, then how do you protect the nation? Well, remember what Madison said. We need an effectual, good militia. Take a look at what Elbridge Gerry said. What, sir, is the use of a militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the bane of liberty. Now, first of all, what does bane mean? If you're not a widespread reader, you're thinking Bane. Wait a minute, he's a character in Batman. He's one of the bad guys. Which would tell you that Bane is bad, right? I mean, it means murderer, slayer, a source of harm or ruin. Okay, that's what Bane means. So notice, here's one of our founding fathers saying a standing army is the bane of liberty. See, the founders wanted us to keep our militia system so that we would not have to rely on large, permanent standing armies. They even passed a law, I mentioned this earlier in class, in 1792, that required every male to have a military firearm and the ammunition for it. Now, obviously, we don't do that anymore. We now rely on standing armies and professional police forces for our defense. So the question is, has there been any problems? Well, one of the classic recent examples of federal abuse happened in Waco, Texas in the mid-1990s, and you'll be reading about this in Chapter 8. But in a nutshell, you had an extreme case of revenge on the part of federal agents. And this is not to say that all federal agents are bad, because of an example like this. It is just to say, here's what can happen where you have too much power corrupting absolutely, right? But here's what happened, and because most of you may never have heard of the situation in Waco. But after an initial shootout, hey, what happened to? Okay, that should be the picture that we left on, right? Okay, so we're talking about Waco, Texas. Yeah, it's probably the BATF hacking us because they don't like us talking about this. Anyway, so we were talking about how they got back at this group of loners in Waco, and what ended up happening. This was in the early 90s. More than 70 men, women, and children were burned to death. Now, ATF agents stormed their homes. Why? Well, they claimed that there were illegal guns there. The local sheriff had already investigated them, though, and they had cleared them. The sheriff had cleared them. These people were called the Branch Davidians. They're a cult, or were a cult. They're kind of like a far-away offshoot from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm not saying that church is a cult, but these guys were. And they had strange, quirky views. I mean, they called the government Babylon. In the video that I'm going to show you, and I'll post it here again, ready to go, you're going to be referring to the government. Again, they were quoting the law, okay? Now, start the video at 1 minute and 20 seconds and then run it to the end. I mean, it's only maybe 3 minutes long total. So start at 1:20, go to the end, and then tell me when you're done, and then we'll just wrap up class real quick. So go ahead. Okay, there's a lot thrown at you right there. That's the movie trailer. You can actually watch the whole thing on YouTube if you're interested. But their homes burned down. The Attorney General said, nope, we didn't insert flammable gas into the building. You even heard one of the senators saying, nope, that wasn't done. Then the Texas Rangers did their own investigation, and guess what they found? They found canisters of flammable gas that had been inserted by the FBI into the building. Guess what? These people had had their electricity cut off, so what were they using for warmth and for light? Yeah, open flames. So what happens when you insert flammable gas into a building like that? Whoosh, yeah, boom. So not only did they lie, the federal government was involved in destroying evidence, lying about evidence, concealing evidence, removing evidence. I mean, it's a really heinous example. You know, they bulldozed the entire area after the fire, thereby destroying most of the evidence that could have shown the FBI's wrongdoing. The tanks crushed all the exit ways, so people couldn't flee. And then, if you do watch the long video, you actually see FLIR evidence, forward-looking infrared, which shows gunfire coming from the FBI position into the compound, into the living areas as people were trying to flee. So the actual motive for the siege at the beginning was the actual motive based on like private statements that were uncovered during the investigation was they wanted a big like a big arrest right before congressional hearings, dealing with funding for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Okay, so they wanted a high-profile arrest. What happened was when they charged the compound and they were throwing flashbangs in, it was a no-knock type entry. And so what ended up happening was the people inside thought they were paranoid anyway, and so they thought they were under attack, which they kind of were, and so they shot back. Well, they killed 4 agents. That's when the revenge motive set in, and that's why it ended up, there you have, because this type of thing, let's face it, this type of thing doesn't happen every day in our country. But, you even see movies on this. Well, what happens if, like, somebody who's innocent is perceived as, having killed a cop? Well, they're running for their life because, cops are going to want to take them out. And, it's a sinful revenge motive that, it's the sinful nature of man. Well, here they had the power to do it, and not only did they do it, they tried to hide the evidence, bulldoze the evidence. Yeah, using the tanks, you're not supposed to be able to use tanks inside this country for law enforcement. There's laws against that. However, there's certain loopholes which say, well, if there's a drug connection, you can get military equipment like that. And so the FBI lied because there wasn't any drug connection. They did have a lot of guns in this place, but they didn't have illegal drugs. Yeah, what a loophole, exactly. And so they lied to get the tanks, and they got the tanks, and they used the tanks to crush the exits, and they weren't firing mortars into there, but they were firing flammable gas into there. So it was really, really heinous. In fact, if you've ever heard of the Oklahoma City bombing, that was actually motivated because of what happened here. A lot of Americans were disgusted when they saw this on their TVs. Sadly, some people then themselves take revenge, and so the guy who blew up the building in Oklahoma City found a building where you had ATF and FBI agents working in the same building, and so he blew up the building. Now, that's obviously an evil response to an evil act, and it was really sad, too, because there was a daycare center on the first level of that building. And so, you've got people that have nothing to do with ATF and FBI, but this guy didn't care. It was just horrid all the way around. Anyway, this led to a lot of congressional investigations, etc., and a lot of junk was uncovered on the FBI and the ATF. Anyway, so again, it's a reminder of the sinful nature of man. It's a reminder of what our founders were trying to warn us about. Now, on the positive end, the fact that we have people who, the type of people who typically work in law enforcement live in the communities, and so that that really helps. Where you have real problems is when a government starts employing people that don't come from the community, or even worse, people that don't come from that country. You know, sometimes we call them mercenaries. That's where you really start having abuses of liberties. But anyway, I get ahead of ourselves. We'll get into more on this next week and in your reading, as you're going to be reading about not just police force, but now military force. Yeah, we're going to get booted soon.